Hello? Testing.
Hi, Mr. Anderson.
Oh, good. It's working. All right. Well, I'll give everybody a few minutes to join in, and we'll get started in maybe about at 11:05.
Damn, I just crashed.
Okay, we'll get started in about 1 minute. Okay, I think we're ready. All right, I'm going to go ahead and click. First of all, thank you guys so much for joining. I truly appreciate it, and I hope you guys enjoy what we're about to do. I'm about to click share screen. This is my first time doing this, so can just at least one person speak up and say, yes, you can hear me, and yes, you can see the screen. Host disabled participant. Oh, am I a participant?
I think so. It was hosted by like Learning Link. So
Uh-oh. Tina, are you there?
Okay, so now you're a host, Mr. Anderson.
How do I do this? Did I join as a participant?
Yeah, so you should be able to share your screen now. Does it let you do that?
All right, it's good now.
Okay.
Okay, do you guys see that?
Yes. Vietnam.
All right,
Yep.
let's rock and roll. All right, well, let's just go through this. And it should take about the length of a class period. And then when we're done, you guys can ask any questions, either about this or whatever else is going on. Sound good? All right, let's do it. I'm just paranoid that like this is not working and you guys can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Everyone should be able to.
All right, we're gonna do it. Okay, Vietnam. So I call this the Vietnam case study because as you can see, Vietnam right there, and about as far away from the United States as you can get. And just by studying this little sliver of the world, it kind of, so many of the major themes and developments and patterns of the 20th century kind of ran through Vietnam. So we're going to click through and see how Vietnam is like a perfect sort of microcosm for so much of what the 20th century was about. Let's go back to the beginning of the century, and when the 20th century turns, Vietnam is a French colony that you guys might remember. As you can see here, this primary source is from a French parliamentarian in 1883, writing about why France should more firmly seek imperial control over Vietnam. And you can see sort of some of our buzzwords that we studied back in Unit 6.
Yo, he pulled out. She's like, tell them no.
What's that? Anyway, you can see the desire to have Vietnam be an export market, like you can see here, for French industrial products that are being made. You can see that, listen, we have to go to Vietnam because our superior French civilization has a duty to civilize inferior races over like people like in Vietnam. He mentions that French industry and French ships are all over the world. And so they need places like Vietnam to rest and refuel. And he mentions Vietnam, he mentions Madagascar. Basically, the French language, the French customs, food, the way they dress, the way their cities look. France is the most advanced place on earth, and it would be a shame if France couldn't spread the French way of life as much of the world as possible. One thing that I think is, obviously a really important colonial theme that has also affected the post-colonial world is the main trading pattern that we've been saying over and over this semester, that Vietnam was looked at as a source of raw materials for French industries. And then once French businesses made finished products, the people of Vietnam could then buy those goods. That is how a colony makes money for a mother country. So you can see here that Vietnam would be a source of rice and coal and minerals and rubber and other things that would feed the growing populations of French cities who weren't growing their own food anymore, or things that would be the raw materials for French factories. And then those goods would be sold back to the people of Vietnam. Kind of like what we saw back in Unit 6 or studying India, is the French did significantly invest in Vietnam. There were a lot of railroads and highways and harbors and bridges and canals and cities and restaurants and government buildings, all kinds of stuff like that. So there were some people in Vietnam who, of course, liked the French being there. And there were, in fact, I don't know if you guys know this, but Vietnam still had like a king the entire time France was there. So they were kind of like a French ally. I mean, they were like a puppet ruler. They kind of had to do what the French had to say. But still, they were like allies with the French because they could say they were modernizing their country and bringing it into the 20th century with all this stuff. But why would the French invest in railroads and highways and harbors and all that stuff? It's to make more money off of Vietnam. You know, it's to make it so that it's even easier to sell their goods in Vietnam and even easier to extract the resources of Vietnam. And of course, we have French companies coming in and doing all this, like the mining that's happening in Vietnam. And the companies building the railroads, they're not Vietnamese companies and engineers, they're French companies and engineers. You know, so that's kind of like the economic imperialism we talked about. Okay, moving on. What does Vietnam look like during World War I? Well, it being a French colony, it was a part of the theme of total war. And the major powers that fought World War I pulled their colonies into the war and requisitioned troops and supplies and food to help on the war effort. So you can see here that some Vietnamese soldiers were basically drafted into the French army and showed up to fight on the Western Front. I just love this picture. Like, you know, you can see like the traditional Vietnamese military dress, but here they are on the Western Front getting off at a railroad depot. And what I find fascinating is that when the war was over, this is when Ho Chi Minh makes his first like introduction into history. And of course, Ho Chi Minh is going to be a big part of our story today. He's the nationalist leader that's going to lead the Vietnamese independence movement later. But he doesn't first pop up in history in the 50s and 60s in the Vietnam War. He was in Paris during the Peace of Paris when they were kind of writing the Treaty of Versailles back in 1919. And this is an excerpt of sort of like the official diplomatic request and proposal that he submitted to the Paris Peace Conference. He had already started to read Marxism-Leninism. He had joined the French Communist Party. And in this document, he tried to use the word like the Western Enlightenment against them. He talked about how the people of Vietnam need self-determination and how the French should adjust their colonial claims. Those are phrases straight out of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Over here, this 8-point bulleted list talking about how the people of Vietnam should have the same like Bill of Rights guarantees as people in France. The same rights to a fair trial and the freedom of the press and freedom of speech and freedom to form political parties and freedom to travel and freedom to write their own political or educational curriculum. So really using the language and main ideas of the Enlightenment to inspire and justify Vietnamese independence. It's really interesting, you know, how the West comes up with these ideas like the Enlightenment and constitutionalism and the Bill of Rights, but thinks they only apply to like the mother country and not to the peoples they were ruling. And this is an example of a nationalist leader using those ideas to justify independence. Moving on, when we get to 1930, then Ho Chi Minh has moved back home. He has founded Vietnam's first communist party. And he's becoming very politically active as the foremost nationalist leader of Vietnam. You guys might remember nationalism, yes, pride in your country. But what does it mean? What does nationalism mean for places like Vietnam or Indonesia or Egypt, you know, places that were colonies? Nationalism means a desire for independence. And Ho Chi Minh was the one formulating that. But he was formulating it in a communist way. So you can see here in 1930, he wrote that the French imperialists are doing every possible thing to exploit the people of Indochina. Indochina being Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. So we're talking about how imperialism fuels capitalism and vice versa. And all they're doing in Vietnam is exploiting the people and getting rich off them. He talks about how they're hiring Vietnamese workers, but at super low, below just the kind of money you could live off of to work in factories. They're levying heavy taxes on the peasants. They are pouring more and more troops into Vietnam to prevent the Vietnamese people from truly being free. And he worries about how the French are part of this global capitalist conspiracy to stop communism from taking root in China or the Soviet Union. And he specifically mentions them down here. So look at that very last sentence. China, the Soviet Union, they are trying to help oppressed nations. They are trying to help the exploited working class to wage revolution. And this is the way that he talked about it. So it's Vietnamese nationalism, but with a communist lens. That same year, he's founding the Communist Party. I think this is a fascinating 10-point list for what communism is from the perspective of a communist, not from the perspective of the Western Bloc in the Cold War, not from the perspective of communism as like the evil empire that's just exploiting, or that just sets up a totalitarian government. This is, what was the appeal of communism? What was the promise of communism? And it's stuff like this, is that communism does not believe in imperialism. Communism believes in a government run by the workers and the peasants and the soldiers, not by capitalist business owners and bankers. Numbers 4 and 5 are so important. He wants to basically take any French property in Vietnam and nationalize it, confiscate it. Take all French banks and French industries and the railroads and the mines and all that stuff and make it the property of the Vietnamese government, so that any money made by those things can be shared with the people of Vietnam and not be sent back home to France. And this is such an underrated part of why the Cold War was the Cold War, is that America and France and Great Britain and the Netherlands, they knew that communism meant that their property and their businesses and their trading opportunities would be seized by communist governments, nationalized by them. So here Ho Chi Minh is saying, yes, we do want to do that so we can share that wealth with the people instead of having it being exploited and sent back to France. Okay, go to number 6. We're going to try and help out the people of Vietnam. We're going to have an 8-hour workday. We're going to let there be more democratic freedoms. They can vote on their leaders. And then 9 and 10. Communism promises that resources will be spent on education, and there will be official equality of men and women. You might remember that Marxism is one aspect of it, is that it's kind of what we would call feminists today. They didn't see an inherent genetic difference between men and women. Men and women were only different because of economic forces. So here, women could contribute to the economy and be equal members of society. Okay, what's the next thing that happens? I know we kind of got this cut short a little bit, and we couldn't quite fit in a lot on World War II before the school closed, but you guys might remember that, of course, Japan was the rising military imperial power of East Asia, and Japan did launch their conquest trying to build that greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere with the invasion of China in 1937, and then this new wave of imperialism in 1940, and Pearl Harbor was a part of that. But as you can see, right down there, Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were a part of this. So from 1940 to 1945, Vietnam was no longer a French colony. Vietnam was a Japanese colony. And so Ho Chi Minh turned his nationalism towards fighting off Japan and waging a guerrilla war against Japanese occupation. And I find this fascinating because so many American students in the United States of America looks at the Vietnam War as just this thing in the 1960s, Vietnam versus the United States. But really, the Vietnam War is like the Vietnamese struggle for independence. That's going to go back here to 1940. It's going to go back to World War II and last for 35 years. Okay, when the war was over, like right after the war was over, and France had been occupied by Germany throughout World War II, but the United States had just gotten Japan to surrender in August of 45. This is when Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party take this moment in time to declare independence from France and Japan and everybody and become an independent state. And these are his actual words. And if you've started to read them, you'll look at the first 2 sentences. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He straight up uses the words of the Declaration of Independence to say, we, Vietnam, are going to declare independence based on the same principles of humanity and justice and enlightenment ideals that guided American independence 150 years earlier, can do the same now. So we kind of saw that earlier with using Enlightenment ideas to justify the independence of a colonial peoples. Why can't it apply to Vietnam in the 1940s the way it did to the British colonies of the 1770s? However, the French didn't quite see it that way. The world did not immediately accept this Declaration of Independence, and the French continued to try to hold colonial control over Vietnam for a variety of reasons. France, having been devastated in World War II, wanted to hang on to Vietnam as a colony to help them rebuild their economy. They also knew that Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and they did not want Vietnam falling to communism, and they knew that that would lead to all the seizure of French businesses and stuff like we talked about. So France continued to try to rule Vietnam like a colony. And so for the next 9 years, Ho Chi Minh and the communists, mainly situated in the north of Vietnam, began to wage a guerrilla war of resistance, what we would call an insurgency against the French. And it all came to a head after about 9 years of this. The French fought a decisive battle against these communist guerrilla forces in an area in North Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, in which the French lost. This is the newspaper from Paris, announcing that the French had to retreat from that. And in fact, this was the battle that made the French realize they were no longer going to be able to have united, firm colonial and military control over Vietnam. And they began to look for a way to come to terms with the communists and look for some sort of peace. So enter the summer of 1954, and the major world powers of the early Cold War met in Geneva, Switzerland, to negotiate an end to this French Indo-Chinese war. So in attendance were China and the Soviet Union and Ho Chi Minh and his Communist Party, and then also the French and the United States and the UK on the other side. And they tried to work out an end of these hostilities. The agreement was, or I thought I had a map. Well, anyway, let's skip to the map. Okay, the agreement was to take French Indochina, as you can see on this map, and divide it into Laos, Cambodia, and then 2 different Vietnams. They did agree to partition Vietnam at the 17th parallel, in which, because Ho Chi Minh and the communists were in pretty firm control of the northern half of the country. But the French still had military control and occupied the south half of the country, and that's where the Vietnamese emperor lived, and he was siding with the French instead of with the communists, obviously. So an agreement was made to split the country there. So they created 4 countries out of that French colony: Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, and South Vietnam. But they agreed that North Vietnam and South Vietnam should not stay 2 separate countries forever. And instead, the people of Vietnam would get to vote in 1956, 2 years later, for what type of government they would want to lead them as one united country. As you might imagine, that vote never happened for a variety of reasons. But basically, both sides didn't trust the other side, and that vote will never end up happening, and Vietnam will remain split through the Vietnam War. The Ho Chi Minh and the communists move ahead as the legitimate government of North Vietnam, and they pass a new constitution. In this constitution, it captures a lot of these sort of promises of communism, like we said earlier. Stuff like protections for workers, stuff like 8-hour workdays, stuff like women getting equal rights with men, equal pay as men. The state will make sure that the government is fully funding daycares and schools and maternity leave and things like that, to like really take care of the people. Like that is the promise of communism. That is why so many people have benefited from communism or seen it as a good thing throughout the 20th century, is that this is what communism can promise its people, is sort of these promises that were captured in this constitution. However, Vietnam was, of course, it was a part of broader world forces. You know, now that we've entered the 1950s and 60s, we're firmly in the Cold War. So being a underdeveloped country, having been a colony for so long, Vietnam was in need of trading partners, and Vietnam was in need of foreign aid. And Vietnam was in need of military support. And of course, the two countries that could provide that in the context of the Cold War were China under Mao Zedong and the USSR, who in the 50s was under Nikita Khrushchev. And they are going to provide that type of support, like I said, to North Vietnam throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Again, in the form of aid and in the form of military support, like this missile you can see here. Meanwhile, the southern part of Vietnam, let's look at that map again, is still supported by the French. That's where, again, all the French businesses and things are. That's where the Vietnamese emperor is. That's where the United States has an interest in stopping the spread of communism everywhere because of their doctrines of containment and the domino theory that you guys have been reading about over the last couple of weeks. So South Vietnam has its own sources of military equipment and financial aid and trading partners. And so Vietnam becomes this proxy or this substitute for the larger Cold War. So I put this question here in red in the top right. What is a proxy war? The word proxy means a substitute. So the United States and the Soviet Union and the other major powers of the Cold War were nuclear powers. And there was no way, or they really didn't have much of an interest in fighting against each other directly, a large-scale military confrontation. Instead, they wanted to spread their influence to as many countries as possible. And so their influence could be in the form of selling them weapons, or spreading their political system, or being a trading partner, or using their same monetary system, or their same banking system, just things like that. So places like Korea, or places like Vietnam, or places like Angola became these proxy battlefields where there were two different groups fighting for power within the country. And each group was getting weapons and support and trade from the different blocks of the Cold War. So that's where the Vietnam War comes from. Now, I can't really get into a sidetrack on the whole Vietnam War, obviously, but the Vietnam War is not just this thing of the 1960s where the United States goes in because of the domino theory. As you can see, the roots of the Vietnam War really go back to the 1940s when Vietnam is fighting against Japan. The Vietnam War was already going in the 1950s when Vietnam was fighting against France. The Vietnam War was it just had an American phase from the mid 1960s until the early 1970s, as eventually the United States of America just kept sending more and more equipment and advisors and troops to support the Vietnamese government trying to stop the spread of communism in South Vietnam. I will back up and say one thing, just so I don't completely skip over this. This is kind of what the map of Vietnam looked like during the Vietnam War. And really, how the American phase of the Vietnam War starts is that, like we said, South Vietnam became its own independent country, and they refused to hold that nationwide referendum on what type of government they wanted. And this really angered a lot of the peasants in Vietnam who were going to vote for communism. And this also really angered North Vietnam and the communists who thought they were going to win the election and the whole country would become united under communism. And so really around 1955, 1956, when South Vietnam backed out of doing that referendum, that's kind of when this phase of the Vietnam War starts. This is when the communist sympathizers in the South begin to resist the government and fight kind of a small-scale guerrilla war and insurgency. And this is when North Vietnam starts to send men and supplies and weapons and money to the communists of the South. So if you ever heard of the Vietnam War, like some of the terminology, and you hear about the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh, these were the North and South Vietnamese communists that began to work together to resist the government and fight against the government of South Vietnam. And so the United States at first just began to send like military advisors and tanks and planes and stuff that the Vietnam could use to fight this insurgency itself. And it just became this mission creep. It began to snowball and snowball and snowball. And eventually, by the mid-1960s, the United States began pouring its own troops into the country to try and stop this insurgency, which they can never do because it's really, really hard to win a war when you're fighting in this unfamiliar terrain and jungles and the enemy keeps doing like hit and run tactics. Anyway, again, I don't want to say too much about the Vietnam War, but by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, both sides were looking for a way out of this. The United States is going to suffer 58 or 59,000 deaths during the Vietnam War and another 150,000 injuries. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the people of North Vietnam suffered way worse. I mean, at least over 1 million people died in North Vietnam from American bombing campaigns. So both sides began looking for a way out. Ho Chi Minh wrote this letter to Richard Nixon, trying to offer to sit down to work out a just peace. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh will die later this year in 1969, and we'll get to see the end of the Vietnam War and the unification of his country. Ultimately, Richard Nixon did campaign on putting an end to the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon does get elected in 1968. For the next few years of the war, the United States tried very hard to train the South Vietnamese army to be able to fight the war on their own. But ultimately, once American troops pulled away, North Vietnam did invade South Vietnam full scale and overwhelm it. And North Vietnam invaded Vietnam, captured the capital of Saigon in 1975, and unified Vietnam for the first time in 20 years in 1975, becoming one country again. This is one of the most famous images of the Vietnam War. These were the last Americans living in Vietnam. In 1975, they were working in the Saigon embassy, and this is them getting airlifted, like literally as the communist troops are like entering the gates of Saigon. Okay, this is another thing that's going to be tricky to do in just a few minutes, but another one of our unfortunate themes of the 20th century is the theme of genocides, is the theme of how there were some like government-directed efforts to exterminate a group of people. And they kind of used the full powers of the government bureaucracy and resources to carry it out. We saw it a little bit with, or we talked about it a little bit with Turkey, or excuse me, the Ottoman Empire and the Armenians in World War I. We see it again with, of course, Nazi Germany and the Jews of World War II. And then examples, we see it with when there was a change in power in Rwanda in the early 1990s, when the Hutus come to power and take out what they thought were years of colonial vengeance against the Tutsi group in Rwanda. And now Cambodia is another example of this. And it's related to the Vietnam War. So what happens is Cambodia, which neighbors Vietnam, in 1975, this sort of radical communist group, which once upon a time had gotten Vietnamese support, decides to take over the country in a coup in 1975. And they are led by this radical, extreme vision of turning Cambodia into this communist agrarian utopia. Basically, they wanted there to be no cities, no Western education, no religion, no rich people, no scientists, no members of the media. Like anything you might associate with something that looks Western was to be eradicated. This was going to be just a perfect agrarian nation of peasants living in harmony and cooperation. This really radical, twisted vision of a society like that. But Cambodia had been a part of French Indochina for the last 80 years. So Cambodia had tons of people living in cities or working in industries, or it had doctors and lawyers and professionals. It had, of course, thousands of years of history of Buddhist monks and Hindu temples in the country. And this Khmer Rouge wanted to eradicate all of that, where everybody would just be this exact same agrarian peasant. So in trying to forcibly turn Cambodia into this vision of theirs, approximately 2 million Cambodians will die from just executions, from starvation, from forcing people out of their homes or their cities into labor camps. And nobody could really do anything about it because, you know, the Vietnam War was ending at the same time. Part of why this happened was Cambodia became a part of the Vietnam War. Cambodia, some of the Vietnam War kind of spilled over. And the United States began bombing this Ho Chi Minh Trail, like I showed you on this map, where that's how North Vietnam got supplies into South Vietnam, was through Cambodia and Laos. And the U.S. began bombing Cambodia to stop that. And it led to, of course, a lot of suffering of the people of Cambodia. And some of them, of course, it made them turn against all things Western. So that's kind of what this slide says. So by 1975, this Khmer Rouge, the Khmer is this ethnic group, and Rouge means red for communism. They seized control of the capital city, they took over the government, and they began doing those policies I said. Emptying all the cities into labor camps, and trying to turn the country into this rural, classless society of collective farms. The leader was Pol Pot, and he declared 1976 year zero. Like, we're starting a whole new civilization here in Cambodia. Again, like I said, some of the people that were targeted were all things Western or religious. Doctors, teachers, monks, journalists, people with money, people with an education. I mean, just anything like that were targeted and for revenge or for extermination. This new society would have no money, markets, schools, private property, foreign clothing, religion, temples, anything like that. A really, really radical vision that they were trying to launch in 1975. Ultimately, this was so extreme and so brutal and caused so many refugees running away from them that were pouring into Vietnam, that when the Vietnam War was over, Vietnam actually invaded Cambodia to try and overthrow the Khmer Rouge and put an end to this insanity. And so for about the next 10 years or so, the Khmer Rouge lost power and fought to retake power as like a guerrilla movement for the next like 10 or 15 years. Eventually, Vietnam did withdraw in 1989, and Cambodia did form a coalition government. They did win the insurgency against the Khmer Rouge, and the monarch was kind of put back on the throne in 1993. But just crazy, brutal stuff. How the Vietnam War and this part of the world ended up, unfortunately, becoming another example of that theme of like a government-sponsored genocide. Another theme that we got to see back in Unit 6 was the theme of migrations. And one pattern of migration that we saw was people leaving underdeveloped countries for economic opportunity elsewhere, or people leaving their countries to go move to, if they were a colony, to go try and move to like their mother country to seek opportunity. And Vietnam is absolutely an example of that. So Vietnam had large-scale migration as people tried to move to French, like France or other French areas. And then as a result of the Vietnam War, some of them tried to flee the Vietnam War and go to the United States, who was, of course, had a big role in the Vietnam War. So this map kind of shows you some of where the Vietnam refugees were resettled during the Vietnam War. And this shows you the impact of like Vietnamese culture spreading to France or the United States. And, so just think about that next time you ever see the Vietnamese restaurant or somebody of Vietnamese ancestry living in the United States or France. And there's a good chance they might have come from the Vietnam War era. Like their parents or grandparents or ancestors might have come from the Vietnam War era or earlier. Now, I'm going to leave you with a few last themes here. The Vietnam War was, again, really wasn't this thing in the 1960s. The Vietnam War was really 1940 to 1975. It was this 35-year war of independence led by Ho Chi Minh, his successors in the Vietnamese Communist Party. By the all that was over and they could finally start focusing on their economy truly, their economy begins to look very Chinese. So this will be a good review of what you guys are reading about in Unit 7 and 8. But they instituted 5-year plans. And these 5-year plans were about hitting major growth in industries and not having to import as many goods from foreign countries, and collectivizing farms, and increasing the income and standard of living for people throughout the countryside of Vietnam. And to build lots of infrastructure to set all this up. and of course to seize the property of foreigners or of landlords to achieve this collectivization. So again, and then their main trading partners became the Soviet Union and China. One very underrated thing that is going to have a huge impact on Vietnam and India and China and a lot of Asia was, of course, a lot of these countries had very big populations to feed, and they were underdeveloped and industrializing. And one thing that greatly helped them in that was when they began to have major advances in agricultural productivity. And this wave of increased agricultural productivity that swept the world after World War II, we call it the Green Revolution, in which there were major scientific breakthroughs in irrigation, in like high quality, high yield seeds that were genetically modified, and fertilizers, and chemicals to kill insects, like pesticides. And these things all combined are called the Green Revolution. And they just, again, they revolutionized the economy and the lives of so many hundreds of millions of people in like India and Southeast Asia and China. And once so much more food could be made and food security was so much more well taken care of, and these countries could grow and export so much more food, it helped them with their industrialization too. So I know I said that very quickly, but I hope you guys see how important the Green Revolution was to kind of helping the development of the third world. Then I know that we haven't had a chance to talk about this on our own, and I didn't assign this reading, so I hope this kind of makes sense. But by the time you hit the 1980s, Vietnam starts to go through the same pattern of development as what was happening in China, is that they were still a socialist economy, but they began to introduce some what we call market reforms or some liberalization, kind of like the perestroika of Gorbachev, or the reforms that many in the West attribute to Deng Xiaoping of China, if you guys remember that from your packet. That there would be some private businesses allowed, that we would allow trade and investment from foreign countries in the West again. Vietnam, wanting to lower their birth rates to help with GDP per capita, did a 2-child policy instead of a 1-child policy. And because of this, because of the Green Revolution, because of their economic progress, and because of some of these policies, in the 1990s, Vietnam was a success story. They were one of the fastest growing economies of the world, and they had one of the best rates at tackling poverty and eradicating poverty in the world. And this is so much mirrors what we were seeing with China at the same time. How China began to open up its economy and see some of these market reforms and trade with the West again, and it had some of the same results. To further this theme, Vietnam, this hotspot of the Cold War that was a major ally of China and the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, it joins a free trade organization called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in which it's now going to cooperate politically and economically with its neighbors in Southeast Asia. And it was going to join and really participate in the United Nations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. This is all Unit 9 stuff that we're probably going to have to cut a lot of that stuff out of this class for you guys this year, unfortunately. But this is a map of who are the ASEAN countries. And one of our major things we were going to cover in Unit 9 was, what is a free trading organization? Like, what are the supposed benefits of globalization that made the countries of Europe form the European Union, or made the countries of Southeast Asia form ASEAN? And in a nutshell, I tried to put it here on this slide for you guys, is that these free trade agreements, free trade leads to more economic growth. It allows countries to specialize in their areas of advantage. It allows them to cooperate. It allows them to share infrastructure. It allows them to take down travel restrictions and tariffs and things like that. And all these things just lead to more economic growth and prosperity for the people. Free trade has downsides, and we might get to that later this year, but these are the benefits of free trade. And so Vietnam kind of joins this part of the world economy. This is so exactly the opposite of the mercantilism or tariffs or economic nationalism we studied back in Units 5, 6, and 7, and 4. And then to go further, Vietnam didn't just join a regional trading association. In 2007, it joined the Global Trading Association, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which is a supranational organization that works to knock down trade barriers and tariffs between all the nations of the world. Like, again, think about how different that is from mercantilism, from economic nationalism, from the tariff wars of the Great Depression. The World Trade Organization is trying to get every country to trade with every other country as free and openly and fairly as possible. And Vietnam, just like communist China, is a part of that organization now. And so this is our last theme, guys, before we review the themes and open up to any questions. The one last very modern theme is about what does the Vietnamese economy look like now? I mean, it still, of course, has a lot of people living in the rural countryside making their living off the land. But Vietnam still has one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's one of the fastest growing manufacturing hubs in the world. And the reason is this. It's that over time, you know, manufacturing things was the backbone of the British and the French and the American economies for so long. And it led to such a rising standard of living, and it led to such, so many just like rising wages and what workers were could expect over time, that really, guys, by the time you hit the 1970s and 1980s, this is when manufacturing in the West peaked. And it just started to become too expensive to pay Western workers to work in manufacturing, you know, to work in plants and factories and on assembly lines. It just became too expensive to pay unskilled workers. And one of the most important things about the world you guys live in right now is you were seeing the results of how over the last 20 or 30 years, all of the new manufacturing jobs that don't require high skill, like engineering or computer talent, all those jobs are being set up in places like Vietnam or China or Mexico or Bangladesh. These former colonies in these former third world countries, because these workers can get paid lower wages and expect less compensation from the companies. And so manufacturing has really spread to other markets in other parts of the world over the last 20, 30 years. And that's just that so much of our economy today and a lot of people's frustration with the economy today is because of that. So they say even, you know, so many of the goods that Americans consume are made in China, but even China has quickly growing wages and standard of living. And so more and more, a lot of the world's companies are looking to Vietnam as one of the next great centers of manufacturing. And that's what we're seeing here. So just one of the final theme I wanted to leave you with was over the last 20, 30 years or so, is that like making things in factories with relatively unskilled labor, like assembly line type of stuff, mass produced type of stuff, that is being done more and more in the Chinas and Vietnams and Bangladeshs of the world, where it used to be done in the Canadas and UKs and Frances and USAs of the world. And that's kind of what this is explaining. Okay, so to recap, everything you heard of the last 100 years of Vietnamese history, it captured how Enlightenment thought spread to Vietnam and was an inspiration for their revolution. How the French imperialism was there because they had a civilizing mission in Vietnam. How the French spread their empire in Asia, kind of around the same time there was the scramble for Africa. How Vietnam was a part of the dominant trading pattern of the late 18 and early 1900s, that underdeveloped economies produced raw materials and sold those raw materials to industrialized countries who made finished goods and then sold them back to the underdeveloped countries. Vietnam was pulled in and affected by World War I, being a colony of France. It was a part of World War II, as it was a part of the Japanese Empire. Vietnam had a byproduct of contributing to the Cambodian genocide. Vietnam was a hotspot, a proxy war for 20 years. The Vietnam War was a proxy conflict in the Cold War. And as the major powers supported two opposing sides in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh perfectly represents the idea of nationalism, seeking independence for his country. Whereas India was able to do it peacefully, through people like Nehru and Gandhi and some others, Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam represents having to fight violently for independence, like Angola or Algeria. Vietnam represents the theme of migration. Vietnamese workers migrating to other parts of the world, including Australia or the US or France. And then finally, Vietnam represents some 20th century themes of it's beginning to embrace free trade, globalization, market reforms, and even though it's still a communist government, and more and more manufacturing is being concentrated there as it is an industrializing country. When you guys get a chance, whether it's right after you hang up here or whether it's maybe sometime over the next week or so, I would love it if you kind of were to click back through this PowerPoint and just focus on 2 of those themes from here, and just kind of see if you can explain how Vietnam fits 2 of these themes here on this concluding slide. There we go. I went very fast, so we're only at 50 minutes. I hope that my computer worked the whole time and you guys heard all that. And now, if you guys want, why don't we talk a little bit about any questions you have about Vietnam? And then once we're done with that, we can open it up to a general Q&A about what is going on with school right now. Okay, so let me go back to this.
Mr. Anderson.
Yeah.
What was China's response to the Cambodian genocide?
Man, specifically China's response to the genocide. I'm not entirely sure. That's why I'm pausing. It says here, and I have to read more about it, that the Khmer Rouge did get some support from China and the Soviet Union, but like that deserves a lot more of an explanation, like what kind of support and why. And I actually don't really know. In fact, as soon as we're done here, I'm gonna look that up too, because I mean, the Khmer Rouge is pretty, I mean, I would love it if somebody could speak up and give me a counterpoint, but they do seem kind of pretty, indisputably evil. Like this is just like an insane ideology, and I don't know how anybody would support them. Most of what I've heard about this is how, the worst years of the Khmer Rouge were about 75 to 79, and it's usually talked about how it was like a forgotten genocide and the world didn't do much about it. But still, you're right. It is right on China's borders. I'm sure there were some refugees going to China. So what was China doing? I don't know. Let's look it up as soon as this is over.
Hey, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
where did the Khmer Rouge come from? I might have missed that part.
Yeah, well, it was a homegrown group. So it was just a, I mean, I can't give you the exact details of like Pol Pot's background, but he was a Marxist Leninist who had a Western education and learned about these principles. And I do know that, like, basically one thing is like, these pretty much every country like of Southeast Asia or of Asia had some communist groups that espoused these principles. But the Khmer Rouge was radicalized by the experience of the Vietnam War. So they were radicalized by the experience of American imperialism in Vietnam, by American bombing in Vietnam and Cambodia, how many millions suffered as a result of that. And this kind of like you might see people in Iraq or Syria or Palestine or Iran or Afghanistan or what have you, that they might see examples of American involvement in the Middle East as like American imperialism leading to unjust deaths, and that radicalizes them and it makes them want to do something about it. That's kind of what happens in Vietnam, is that this radicalizes this communist group of Vietnam to be super anti-Western and want to form this agrarian utopia that is free from all these destructive influences.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, good questions. Anything else?
This isn't about the Vietnam War, but it's about like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
All right.
If like the entire reason Cuba got missiles, from the Soviet Union was to like deter America from invading them, why would they just give it away and then all they had was like an empty promise from the U.S. to not invade them again?
I mean, okay. I guess it just comes down to this. Like, first of all, those weren't Cuba's missiles, right? They didn't build them themselves. Like, they imported them from the Soviet Union, and I actually don't know if they bought them from the Soviet Union or if they were sort of just like given to them by the Soviet Union. But again, they were Soviet missiles imported into Cuba. Then, of course, to resolve the diplomatic crisis, an agreement was made to remove the missiles in exchange for America removing its missiles from Turkey. So you're saying, why would Cuba just give out their missiles? But I mean, they weren't their missiles; they were Soviet missiles. And if Cuba resisted and said, "No, we're not going to give up our missiles," I mean, I guess on the one hand, I see how that makes sense, but on the other hand, like, I mean, I guess if they did that, then they would have been isolated from the Soviet Union. Like the Soviet Union would have, like they would have been keeping their missiles at the expense of breaking diplomatically with the Soviet Union. And then they would have been a completely isolated international pariah.
Okay. Also about the Cuban Missile Crisis, why did the Soviet Union like agree to when the U.S. Specified that they keep the Jupiter missiles in Turkey quiet?
Oh yeah, that question. I think it was just, that agreement was made, but in terms of how the president like released it to the press and the American people, it was, yeah, the Soviets had agreed to back down and take away their missiles. And meanwhile, the Soviets, their press release to their people would have been, yeah, the Americans agreed to take away their missiles in Turkey. So both sides only wanted to mention what the other side gave up, so they didn't look like they gave in to communism. Like the Cold War was such a politicized issue in this country in the 40s and 50s and 60s. And both political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were competing with each other to be like, who could be tougher on communism? Like, for example, when Mao Zedong and the communists won the Chinese Civil War and proclaimed the Democratic or the People's Republic of China in 1949, and Harry Truman and the Democrats were in power, then Republicans used that as a major campaign issue in the next election. Like, the Democrats lost China. They're not tough enough on the Cold War. So it's just that. It's just politics. It's not willing to admit that he had to compromise and give in to the Soviets.
Okay, got it.
Thank you, guys. Anything else? I guess you'll learn a lot more about the Vietnam War next year. I've just always found it fascinating, the Vietnam War. Of course, if you didn't know any better, you would just think it was America versus North Vietnam, but really it's a 35-year thing. But anything else?
So for the AP exam, I like went on their website and stuff, and they still haven't posted the format. Do you know when that'll be in?
Okay, I will begin that conversation, but just keep in mind that so they released some an initial sketch of what things are going to look like last night, and yes, I do know. I am still waiting for the detailed version to be released today. So basically all I know is kind of some highlights from like the leader of the College Board. Basically he had a press conference last night. And I can just give you the sketch of what he said. And then everything should be available to you guys later today, but do you want to hear that sketch?
Yes.
Okay, so as you guys know, it's going to be online only. I guess the two main things you need to know are this. The new test date is going to be 1 week later. So it's Thursday, May 21. And you guys are going to, and it's at 2 p.m. Not anytime, but exactly at 2 p.m. So Thursday, May 21 at 2 p.m. You guys can take it on your phone. You guys can take it on your computer. You can take it on your Chromebooks. You can write it on a piece of paper and take a picture of it. Like they're going to give you a bunch of different ways to do it. And thing number two is there's going to be one question. It's going to be a DBQ, and it's going to have 5 documents. And if they are going to change the rubric, I don't know yet. But it's going to be a 1 5-question DBQ. So there you go.
Okay, thank you.
Now they're going to start to give you guys all kinds of information in the coming weeks about how to log on properly. There's going to be a set, it's either a 40 or 45-minute timer with no exceptions if you turn even 1 second late. And there's going to be all kinds of anti-cheating provisions. So like, just get ready for all that. There's going to be this whole big procedure you have to go through. But that's it. So hopefully we've, and that's how we'll start to, as we come back from spring break and start to look towards the exam, we will focus on some content review, of course, and we will focus on our DBQ skills from afar. But what that'll look like yet is to be determined.
Wait, for the DBQ, is it one question?
Yeah, 1 question, 5 documents.
Will like the prompt be broader than like a specific like prompt that we've gotten before? Like, will it cover like every unit that we've gone over?
No, I'm sure it'll be, well, first of all, I have no idea. But I don't think it works to be broader because like you have to have the documents all from kind of a certain time period to see connections between them, right? And to do outside evidence. I think it'll still be similar to what we've seen in class.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
You know, I hate doing this, but I would probably think it'd be something from this semester, right? Just to help out with having the information be a little more fresh. And, you know, I don't think it'll be something from like the Song Dynasty, let's put it that way. You know, it'll probably be something with industrialization or imperialism or nationalism. But, you know, it only goes up through Unit 6. So it'll stop at the year 1900 in terms of content that might be on the DBQ.
Mr. Anderson,
Mm-hmm.
are we ever gonna have like tests for like online?
I would say there's an extremely low chance you'll ever have another multiple choice test again online this year. As far as having one more test grade, we're talking about it. We'll probably have one more test grade, but not a multiple choice test administered online.
Mr. Anderson, for the, I guess for the potential multiple choice test you're talking about, how is that going to work with like that grading thing they announced last night?
Can you say that again?
Yeah.
What multiple choice thing?
So you said that there could be another multiple choice test. How would that be affected by the new grading procedure they announced last night?
No, I said we will not have another multiple choice test.
Oh, okay.
And with the, I don't really want to comment on the grading procedure thing because again, I haven't had an official communication yet from Fulton County or Mr. Downey, or like I haven't had an official communication to know exactly what the ins and outs are. So I don't think I should probably get into that with you guys yet. So that's also why I can't give you specifics on how many more grades we'll have and all that, because like we need to learn more and then we'll set all that up. Okay, any other questions about the AP test before we go? Okay, cool guys. Well, I really appreciate you joining. I really, really do.